Well, welcome to November's reading recap. November was very full with a lot of traveling, and that made a lot of time for reading. So I read a lot of books in the month of November, which is always so much fun. So I started off with Never Forgotten by Hannah Linder, and I will have to say this is probably my favorite Hannah Linder book, and I think I've read all of them. So it was really fun to dive into this story. It was really interesting because it has a one-sided enemies to lovers relationship with an arranged marriage thrown in. So you have the setup with the guy character and his wife's murder and coming back to England, and then you have the woman that he was supposed to have been married to like a decade ago. And with the setup, you feel like she's gonna just be this snobby rich girl that nobody likes, but then you actually get into her head and see her POV, and it's a really interesting spin on an arranged marriage trope because you have this enemies to lover with the guy's side where he thinks that she's never cared about him and that it was just an arranged marriage, and then you have her side where she kind of is already interested and she's just waiting for him, and he finally comes back, and there's all this drama with his father's death and a clause in his father's will with his inheritance, and then a mystery why his wife was murdered in the first place and his revenge trying to redeem her murder. And it was just a really interesting novel, and I loved all the different layers to it where we had the romance and then we had a bit more of the intensity, and I think it was probably one of my favorite Hannah Linder books. The next book I started is a book that I heard about at ACFW. So I was in a session with Colleen, Coble, and Acker, and they were going into the session about co-writing and how they co-write, and they were going into all these details about this novel that they were working on and that they were getting published, I think, in November. And they were all excited about it, and they were sharing different sneak peeks into it to show the example of how they were writing it together. And there's just a lot of clauses that said redacted, and it was like blurred out. And I'm like, come on, this actually seems interesting. So I was totally hooked by the title of the story, and it is I Think I Was Murdered by Colleen, Coble, and Acker. The concept itself really drew me in with this idea of a woman whose husband dies in a tragic accident that seems like an accident, and then she has this AI bot that she keeps talking with. She's a part of this technology company, and she's messaging this AI bot. They stalked it with all her husband's information, all their texts, all their messages, all their photos, and she communicates with this bot like it's her husband. So it's been a little while since he's died, and she keeps talking to this bot as though it's her husband. And then all of a sudden, the bot says, I think I was murdered. And so she goes down this rabbit hole as she's trying to discover, was her husband really murdered or was it an accident? And as she keeps going down this rabbit hole, it just keeps getting more intense, and she keeps discovering things, and it was a really fun audiobook to listen to. I will say I feel like I got a little bit lost and confused at parts, but I think it was because of an audiobook, and I just don't really listen to audiobooks, so I kind of get lost in them, and I like being able to go back and reread stuff if I miss something, and I just was not able to focus the best on the audiobook. But there were a couple moments that really hooked me, especially at the end. There was just one major reveal that I totally was not expecting. It totally caught me off guard, and it was really cool, and it kind of made everything else make sense. So that was I Think I Was Murdered by Colleen, Coble, and Acker. After that, I felt like doing a reread. I have been thinking about some of Kelly Rimmer's World War II novels for a little while, so I wanted to get into one of those, and so I picked The Warsaw Orphan. I read this a little while ago, and it really hurt me. It was just such an amazing book that was really intense and really, really sad, and I felt like getting into that again. So I picked up A Warsaw Orphan, and it was just such a good book. So it takes place in Warsaw, Poland, when World War II is happening. So Warsaw was completely destroyed and totally bombed out, and a big chunk of the story takes place in the Warsaw ghetto. So it's following a Jewish boy as they're trapped in this ghetto in Warsaw, where there's just a wall dividing them. And on their side of the wall, it's just all Jewish people that are starving and in horrible situations. And then on the other side of the wall, it's Warsaw, just as normal. Obviously, it's not exactly normal because they're in a war and there's bombings and things, but it's just this difference where we have the one main character is on one side of the wall and the other is on the other, and it's just such a good story. I really loved the moment when he was in the Warsaw ghetto, and we're just getting into this depravity of what it was really like in the ghetto for all these Jewish children. He's not that old, and surviving the ghetto. It was just such a good story, and I really, really love this book. I will say it's just one of those stories that really sticks with you you and makes you think and really dwell on what actually happened in that time. So it's just a really good story. Kelly Rimmer's World War II novels are some of my favorite World War II novels, and this is a really good one. Also, I really enjoyed the dual POV. We have the two different characters, and one of her characters is actually from another book. So that was really cool when I realized that similarity, and then I had a light bulb moment, and I was like, I think this is the same character from my all-time favorite Kelly Rimmer book, and it was just a really cool moment. So it's just a really awesome book. After that, we totally switched gears. We got out of World War II and we went back to biblical fiction. So we have Tessa Afsar's new book, The Queen's Cook. So this book felt a lot slower and it was a little bit harder to get into, especially because just looking at it and reading the back cover blurb, I really thought it was going to be an Esther retelling. And I thought it was going to be from a different perspective, maybe of her, the Queen's Cook. And it kind of subverted expectations when it was not an Esther retelling. So it got into everything about Esther, and we went through that moment with the decree, the king's decree to kill all the Jews, and then that was only a brief section of the story. So it kind of threw me for a loop when we got through everything related to Esther really fast, and it felt a little bit slow because a lot of the story was just her in the kitchen and getting into the kitchen. I felt like there wasn't a ton at stake, but I did enjoy a little mystery element that was woven through with the prince's mother. Also, I will say, she did a really good job with all the food descriptions. I love to cook, I love to bake, and it was really fun to read all these descriptions of the food that was culturally appropriate at that time, as she's going into all the different descriptions of what they might have eaten, what they drank, what they enjoyed, all the different things. It was really fun to read those descriptions. And then the last book that I read in November was another book that I got at the ACFW conference, and it is The Garden Girls. So this book drew me in right from the beginning, and it's just a really different novel from what I usually read. It kind of reminds me of some of the thriller sort of stories that I read, but it was really good. It really drew me in. There were a lot of content warnings for this book, and not necessarily in a bad way. It was a little dark, and it was a different type of read than what I usually do. So it's about this FBI agent who's trying to uncover what's happening to these women who are showing up with these disturbing tattoos everywhere of flowers that are related to their names. And so the story itself gets into an FBI side of things with this murder and all these murders and all this connection, and then we have the cult that he used to be a part of. And so it's trying to figure out how the cults and the murders all relate, and if they do relate, and it just really draws you in. It was one of those type of books that you just don't read alone because it kind of creeps you out. It was really unsettling in some parts, and it was really a fascinating story with a lot of different details from his background. And then the best part is that we have the different POVs. So we have the FBI agent, and then it all gets connected to the woman he escaped the cult with, who he loves, who he hasn't seen in years, many years, like 20 years, and her sister, who he used to know, is one of the victims. And so it all comes smashing down as they're trying to figure out what happened, and he has personal stakes in this discovery, and it was just a really interesting story that just drew me in. I really enjoyed reading it. Also, I did not realize until I was like a fourth of the way into the story that it had a prequel. It wasn't actually a prequel, it's just the second book. And I didn't realize that. And ironically, I have the first book. I just didn't realize that this was a sequel. I kind of was starting to get inklings of that as it was sharing about like background things that happened in a different operation and investigation. I was kind of thinking, I feel like they should be giving more details about this, so maybe this is from a previous book. And then I realized there was a previous book and I just didn't research it. This is what happens when you don't research the books that you read. But overall, it was just a really thrilling story that just drew me in and kept me glued to the pages. I really enjoyed the slight romance aspect to it, and then all the deep investigations with the cult and the victims and how everything was kind of tying together. So these are all the books that I read in November. That was a lot of reading. I feel like that was more than I usually do. I feel like I tend to rotate around at the 3 to 4 book range a month, and it was fun to read a lot more this month, and it was a wide variety of stories. I really enjoy having the wide variety of historical fiction and mystery and thrillers and biblical fiction. It was all over the place. So if you read any good books recently, I would love to hear about them. Just drop a comment below and I would love to chat. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.